Good afternoon, and welcome to all of you who come to be part of the Lewis Global Studies Center Annual Conference, Contemporary Women in Islam. I'm Rebecca Hovey. I'm the Dean for International Study and Director over at the Global Studies Center. This afternoon's session is a public interview of the renowned, and I dare say beloved, scholar on gender in Islam, Dr. Amina Wadud, who is here on campus this week as our Global Scholar in Residence. Dr. Wadud is being interviewed by the prolific and similarly recognized professor of religion, Dr. Kecia of Boston University. I want to take this moment to thank all of our sponsors for the conference. We have the Betty Evillard and Jean-Marie Evillard Global Initiatives Fund, the Program in Middle East Studies, SAMS Fund, Department of Government, Department of Religion, and we are here in the back there, Program for the Study of Women and Gender, the Smith College Museum of Art, and the Center for Religious and Spiritual Life. So this really is a campus effort, so thank you to all of our sponsors. So I've done a very, very quick study today of both of your life works. And I can say that the pairing of these two amazing women scholars of Islam here at Smith College is phenomenal and a rare opportunity for all of us to be witness to a sharing of thought, an exchange of still emerging ideas in feminist epistemology and theology. Amina Wadud's early work based on her dissertation, Quran and Woman, Rereading the Sacred Text from a Woman's Perspective, has been a critical text in Islamic studies, feminist theology, and critical hermeneutics. She has inspired a generation of feminist and critical theology scholars whose admiration and recognition of her bold scholarship stands out in their citations. Dr. Wadud was one of the first female imams to lead mixed-gender Friday prayers, acts which have sparked controversy in Muslim communities across the globe. And in her scholarship, she has dared to say no to Islamic scripture on gender roles, a defiance which Ali, in your own work, I found, makes relevant in terms of the contemporary shift of no means no to yes means yes debates in the notion of affirmative consent. Dr. Kecia Ali's own work is influenced by Dr. Wadud's scholarship, and she has served as the co-editor of the celebratory volume, A Jihad for Justice, honoring the life and work of Amina Wadud. Dr. Ali's own work spans Islamic philosophy, sexual ethics, gender relations in the Muslim traditions, and I learned on her blog, even studies of futuristic science fiction.
That's fair.
She serves on the board of directors of the American Academy of Religion, as well as editorial and advisory boards of several leading journals in religious studies. In the dedications to Ali's co-edited volume honoring Dr. Wadud, the co-editors offer the following statements, and I want to read them because I think they say a lot about what we're about to hear. For my beloved teacher and friend Amina, you remind me that I have a heart, a voice, and a body for knowing and living the truth. Lori Silvers. For Amina, whose courage, faith, and integrity continues to inspire me, Julianne Hammer. For Amina, who has boldly shared with us the fruits, both bitter and sweet, of her extraordinary journeys, Kecia Ali. So we are about to have this brief moment to learn directly from both these women in ways that we hope will share these journeys with all of you here today and this weekend. So thank you, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. This is quite a moment. We met more than 20 years ago. If I'm remembering correctly, it was in the Silk Road Cafe by UNC Chapel Hill. And I was there with some colleagues, classmates from graduate school, back when I was a doctoral candidate at Duke. You had published Quran and Woman, which I had read and reread and annotated and written about. And I was starstruck and then charmed by how down to earth you were. I mean, she'd written a book, right? And I'd read the book, and she was there in person, and I could talk to her about the book. And I don't remember, actually, the content of the conversation, but I do remember basking in your presence at that moment without realizing that it would be the start of an engagement that has continued in print and in person and by phone and over email for more than 2 decades. So first of all, thank you. It's been a real enrichment of my life, but also my scholarship, to have you be part of it.
Oh, thank you.
So let me start by asking about Quran and woman, because it's been more than 25 years since the initial publication of the book. It appeared, of course, first in Malaysian edition and grew out of your work with Sisters in Islam, and then was republished by Oxford University Press in 1999. So I have both editions. I'm not willing to give up the first one yet. And I'm wondering if you could just say something about the book, what brought you to the book in the first place, and maybe then where the book has brought you over these decades.
Thank you very much. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I always begin in the name of Allah, whose grace I seek in this and all other matters. I think that when you get to be this year, I celebrate being 65, so it's a nice round number. So I do look back on life and friendships and have a different kind of appreciation for the longevity of some of those relationships. And certainly Quran and woman is something that has had a longevity, I think, totally unexpected. There's just no way that I could have predicted, because I had like zero political intent. I was just a seeker whose love affair with the Quran caused me to immerse myself in sort of an historical intellectual trajectory around that book, and at the same time still left me wanting for what does it mean to be a woman as part of the textual communities. And I just kept finding that things were missing, and I really wanted to be able to highlight that in my study. Now, as a graduate student trying to, complete the PhD, I now advise students to do the exact opposite of what I did. Like, do not attempt to write your magnum opus. It's just a long research paper, and then you can write your magnum opus. But it turned out that somehow I had captured something that has outlived, even my own expectations. Excuse me, but the question was really very innocent, and that is that lived realities in any community are very complex, very nuanced, and yet and still, given whatever political terrains there are, around those communities, sometimes the community gets marked with a trajectory or a characteristic that maybe is of some utility for those outside, either for good or ill. But becoming a Muslim by choice, when I was 20, I never felt for a minute that I should be somehow second in my relationship with my Creator. And yet I had already traveled enough and experienced living, outside of the U.S. and in Muslim communities in the U.S. to be aware that some of what happened in community did not reflect the ideals that I felt were necessary in order for me to sustain an intimate relationship with my Creator. And I felt that the best way for me to figure out what does Allah intend for the role of women was to take it, straight from the sacred text. And I wasn't the first person, obviously, who had related to the text in terms of its intent and its purpose. But when you look back and you find that they are literally all men until the 19th, 20th century, you think to yourself, well, maybe something's missing in this story. And so I did my dissertation with that in mind, and I was actually discouraged from it by my advisors, who wanted me to do what is the normal route for the dissertation, which is you pick a topic and you read everybody who's written on that topic, and you expose what you have learned from them, and then you develop a critique if you have one, and then you justify that critique, and then you write a conclusion, And I just thought the more of these guys that I read, the more invisible I become, and I cannot use them as a reference point. It just doesn't work for what it is that I'm experiencing with this text. So again, the entire process was a total antithetical to what it is that I would recommend anybody ever go through. And I got the PhD, and then, everybody tells you you should take your dissertation and turn it into a book. But I went for my first job, which coincidentally happened to be on the other side of the planet in Malaysia. And I remember trying to explain to my mother where it is. My brother had fought in the war in Vietnam. So I said, like Vietnam, well, go down and then go down, And that's like the best that I could do, even for myself, And instead, it opened me up to something which has had even greater longevity, which is a set of relationships with regard to Muslim women's activism. But the currency of the book sometimes still surprises me because in it I actually don't talk about methodology at all. I do, however, try to apply the method of reading for gender. And it's like 104 pages. It's like such a small book, It has been translated a dozen times in different languages. And for some reason, I think maybe the innocence of the project comes through while simultaneously the profundity of what is being demonstrated in there about the necessity of rethinking any discourse about humans that has been shaped solely on the reality of the experiences of men. That's just par for the course now, right? But in the context of having a sacred text that's so pivotal in the community, it's intellectual, it's spiritual, it's political thrust, to have somebody just sort of, as innocent as it was, not only speak to that, but demonstrate the ways in which it's not happening and give examples of ways in which it could happen, just allowed me to be, as they say, at the right place and the right time to do it. And, the rest is 25 years worth of history.
I want to come back to the question about the collectives of women and women's groups and women's actions, but it is a different time now, right? And I teach Quran and Woman. I teach it regularly in my classes. And a couple of years ago, for the first time, one of my students said, "This is really, really wonderful. It's so fabulous that there's all this talk about women, but what about the very strong binary that's running through this text?" Right? I think it was 2017, at Boston University, when people are thinking about gender, they're thinking about it in ways beyond a dichotomy of male and female. And when I told her that I understood that you were working on these sorts of issues around gender diversity in your new work, she said, "Oh, great, like, how do I get that book?" So I know that the book isn't ready, but I wonder if you might say something about how you move from some of what's in Quran and Woman to a newer set of thinking about human personhood and human servanthood to the creator outside of this binary that, most of us were working with 25 years ago.
Yeah, it's funny because now my definition of Islam includes the location of what I call the hegemonic binary patriarchal neoconservative version of it. That's the one that we all knew. That was the one that I was writing within. And in fact, existing in the context of the binary allowed me to do certain things with regard to equality and reciprocity that now, when I'm trying to reconfigure and look at gender nonconforming realities, it's really a challenge. It's a lovely challenge because the reality is it's very easy to get to a certain point in your work, and then all you do is just repeat that work in other guise. You decide, like the topic of this conference is this, so you write a paper that talks about your work with that topic, and then you write, So for me, I've actually fragmented a stationary box in terms of the binary. And I'm not, I'm visualizing a number of ways to do it. And that includes interrogating the maintenance of that paradigm in so much of Islamic work in ethics and spirituality, and then problematizing it and find, what you describe in your work about the liminal spaces. So what I want to do is I want to continually rescript the notion of a fixed point, and instead try to create like a spoke, a sort of a radiating reality in which there are interactions between certain locations, for lack of a better word, let's just sort of say the positive and the negative, right? Or the plus and the zero that they use in the computer digital language. There is this location, and the problem with that location, number one, is that it gets fixed solid in one place, right? And the other one is that it becomes invoked in certain power dynamics. So again, all of this is, as she said, it's my current research. It's not yet formulated, and I don't want to commit myself and as a consequence lose out on where I could go with it. But it has been a challenge that I have embraced for the possibility of returning to that notion of what it means to be human. And the inspiration for the work I'm doing now is a kind of universal understanding and acceptance that that human beings were created with karama, which is dignity. And so I'm going to, the plan is to go at all the places where it's problematic and allow those places to speak, to articulate, their own presence and reality, and then bounce it off of the rubrics of understanding that we have, even when they're binary, as a way to be able to open up even the categories. So that's the plan, people. Make prayer, because it's not yet formulated. I'm still working on it. But I definitely feel that the binary was both necessary and beneficial to me at the time to examine the power relations in any settings where there is an interaction. And now I realize that inadvertently then I'm participating in creating a stagnation where real life actually has a great deal more of, beauty actually in its complexity. So, we're in process on that one.
One of the things that that has been so striking to me in so many of the conversations that I've had with you over the decades has been the way that you move between being absolutely committed to realizing, to attempting to realize, to attempting to articulate, discern and articulate the highest ideals and the transcendent possibilities, and also being really attentive to practical, lived realities, the way things are for Muslims, especially women or gender nonconforming Muslims. And one of the things that I'm hoping you'll speak a little bit about is your work with Sisters in Islam and with Musawa and with other organizations that are committed to making practical change on the ground. And maybe also to say something about how it is to work having one eye on those very real life considerations without losing sight of the ideals, and also how do you hold on to those ideals when also trying to do practical things.
Yeah, I also, the completion of events in my life, what we call the blessings, was that I came out of graduate school hijabi, and there was a general skepticism that a black woman in the veil could represent ideas about Islam in the context of a secular university. So I didn't get a job, that's the bottom line. So my first job turned out to be in Malaysia, and the coincidence of it was I had been interviewed by a journalist who had done a tenure at my graduate university and did a 3-part series on Muslims in the United States. So she had interviewed me for that. And so she was like my sole contact person in Malaysia, other than the university officials, who are all men, by the way. So I contacted her and said, I'm coming to Malaysia, you know. And they were already meeting a group of women, you know, mostly professional women, who were absolutely clear that they had no problem with their identity as Muslims. So it wasn't like we need to get rid of Islam. That wasn't even on the table. But that they were observing in lived realities such a disparity between their ideas of what they thought, you know, represented justice, you know, and equality. And so they didn't know quite what to do, but they had tried a couple of approaches, mostly legal, before I got there. And when I came, I started meeting with them. And I'm like hooked into this theological abstraction of perfection and utopia. And they're like dealing with all this stuff that has to do with law and policy and culture. And you know, the clash between us, it just opened both of us up to other possibilities. And in the end, by the time Sisters in Islam was organized, it was 8 of us women who had you know, stuck with it for a couple of years. But we began an articulation which actually turned out to be unique and now again is being replicated, and that is the necessity of grappling with the trajectory of Islamic discourses in a critical, you know, gender reading as a way to be able to challenge how they get manifest in real lives, either by culture or by policy. And that took me out of the ivy tower of abstraction down into the realities and shaped then for me an edge in terms of the imperative of being able to grapple with the whole trajectory. But I sometimes had to pull them to think about the theology, which they resisted, and they sometimes had to pull me to think about, you know, the lived realities on the ground, which I resisted. And in the end, these are friendships that have also gone for several decades now, 3 decades. And they now know how to speak through theology, which is a kind of interesting thing. There's a meme out there with Zaina Anwar, who's currently the director of Musawa movement. And it says, God cannot be God if God is not just. Now, anybody who knows anything about the history of Islamic thought would just say, oh, well, that's Mu'tazila, you know. But trust me, people didn't operate out of thinking about the difference between the Mu'tazila and the Ash'aris. They didn't think about that. But what has happened now is that theological talkback has become more common parlance. And that's because of the dynamic relationship that has been encoded now in the work that both Sisters in Islam and Musawa does, which is actually a radical theological engagement, similar to liberation theology in that, again, the context of people's lives takes precedent over text. And that we develop what's called an exegesis of praxis, you know. And the bottom line of that is, can there be justice if Muslim women don't experience justice? So their experiences have come to the fore. And what this did for me, despite whatever amount of resistance, you know, my sort of abstract metaphysical deconstructionism and reconstructionism might prefer, what it did for me is to bring those abstract ideas into a reality where I realized that an idea is only so good as your capacity to be able to put it into implementation. Whereas before I was happy just to float around with the ideas, you know. So it has been a two-way push and pull. Unfortunately for me, one of the consequences of I have now understood that there are 3 prongs to my life that very rarely can I get all 3 of them to be on par, except for somebody like Sadia, which is my own spirituality and my interest in symbolism, liturgy, and worship, and my intellectual, sort of very critical thinking component and my activism. But the reality is that when I have to choose between them, well, first of all, I can't make my brain not be included. So that always has to be there. But I would prefer the activism even over the spirituality, because I see way too many quietists among, the new Sufi communities. I just don't understand ethically how you can arrive at a state of enlightenment that is just you singularly floating above the mountain. I just can't see it if it's not embedded in social justice. So if I had to grapple, my preference would be to grapple with, sort of very secular, hardline Muslims on the ground, because they are dealing with real people. And for me, the task of being human on the planet Earth takes priority over even some of our, highest ideals in articulating what might be our own intimate, relationship with the divine. So I do have to do trade-offs, and I'm aware now what trade-offs I prefer. But I'm also aware of how long and how painful it was that I would have to go into situations and I would have to let off one thing over the other in order to be able to actually work with community and to affect some change. So it's still an ongoing, kind of a tender spot.
So I want to come back to ritual and to spirituality later. But now I want to go back to the job market and to the American job market, right? Because you didn't get a job and you went to Malaysia, but you eventually got a job and you came back and you taught at Virginia Commonwealth and you had a long career there and you were tenured and promoted and you published more. And Inside the Gender Jihad from 2006, you talk a lot about, and I've recently been revisiting for my own purposes, about a field that you call Muslim women's studies. And you talk about how in the academy that's a very fraught idea. And both within institutions and in professional organizations and in public spaces, attempting to operate in a subfield of Muslim women's studies, especially as a Muslim women scholar, especially as a Black woman in a predominantly white institution and in predominantly white professional organizations. There's a lot going on with that. So can you say something about your return to the US and being at Virginia Commonwealth and then your academic career during that next portion of your life?
Yeah, I mean, the reality is I took early retirement because I arrived at a place where it was clear to me, and it has been confirmed in over 10 years that I've been retired, that the U.S. Academy would not be the home for what we are calling the production of new knowledge in Islam. If you look at the field, it is predominantly interested in geopolitics and history, with a smattering of Sufism, which is mostly done from the historical perspective. It's not, investigated as an ethical system of life. And Islamic feminism is one of the newest disciplines on the block. At that time, when I was talking about Muslim women's studies, I highlighted it in that way because, and now it is manifest more coherently in some institutions, because that was what was already, that momentum had already been building. And yet, to build it meant that you had to contend with not just the fragmentation of the disciplines, but also the incapacity of the existing disciplines to understand the necessities for these other dimensions to be given equal space in the, in the discourse and the research. It's been better understood now. So women's studies programs will also be interested in someone who has, focus on Islam and Muslims. And Islamic studies, in this trajectory, unfortunately, Islamic studies moved the slowest. But Islamic studies has also now understood that they need to engage with gender. It didn't exist, and it didn't exist enough at the time where I arrived at one of those mile markers in life. And I literally submitted my documentation for consideration of promotion to full professor, And when I got my full professor, I then tendered my resignation. I think that the academy was a good home for me because I do like intellectual abstractions, and I do like the whole idea of the exchange of learning and inquiry and critical thinking, but it did not nurture me to assist in the ways in which I wanted to, and I still want to reach beyond simply a confirmation of categories that already exist. Once I made the decision, I literally left and I was jobless. I didn't know what would happen, but now when I look back on those 10 years, I have actually had the opportunity to do not only so much of what I love, but also to have an impact in these things happening literally around the globe. And it was a better position for me to be in. Besides, it's so much easier to be an anarchist when you're outside the system. When you're in there, you still have to somehow comply with certain things. And I was a little bit resistant to that. But I am happy to see that there are certain efforts to bring certain things together now, that didn't exist at the time when I left the academy. But it is still, unfortunately, completely uneven. At the time that I, for example, went up for tenure, there were actually no other hijabi Muslim women who were tenured, and none of them in my field. So if there was a hijabi in the medical school, for example, then you didn't come into the humanities and the social sciences. So just imagine that. I mean, it's not even that far-fetched, and it's not even that far, that long ago. And the idea that you could actually engage in critical thinking and wear a hijab was categorically denied in many of the settings that I would go into. And for no other reason, as an anarchist, that meant I would probably wear it longer, It is not yet there. We are all fortunate, by the way. I'm counting on Kecia to be the first Muslim woman president of the American Academy of Religion. Which she definitely will say. She's already shaking her head, right?
Nope.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
No.
But we are not only are we there. There is a cadre of academics with both spirituality and political awareness coming through the academy in all kinds of spaces. By the way, some of them will be here for our conference this weekend, so be sure to check them out. I'm looking forward, in fact, to some of my younger colleagues to see, how they've progressed in their work over the years. It is becoming more palpable, but we are still far behind, and we are faced with the global manifestations of certain realities that are extremely painful. In terms of the progress of understanding, I think really, again, the beauty of the complexity and the diversity of human beings. And Muslims are no exception. We have this diversity even within us. And so our capacity to be able to do things and to actually be able to do those things freely under the guise of, academia, we're pushing to make that happen, and there are places where it is happening individually, for some academics, but it's still not enough. The number of women, for example, who are in endowed chairs in the area of Islamic studies is 1. And it used to be that there were none. In fact, they were all held by white males. And then they started having brown males. And when you have grotesque manifestations like that, it just means that really the entire rubric of learning in the context of US academia is a perpetuation of certain colonialist privileges that actually limits the capacity of the universities to fulfill what is their higher mission. And so my area of study and my concern and my issues is only one of them, but it was enough for me to understand that if I wanted the freedom to be able to continue to develop what I felt was my mandate in being human, that I couldn't do it under the rubric of US academia. And there's not been very much to entice me to think otherwise in the 10 years since I retired. Besides, occasionally I can go and hang out at Smith for a week and I can pretend I'm an academic for a little while.
It's a pretty good gig here, I think. So I want to first emphasize what you pointed out about the way that positions in the academy are still unequally distributed, and note that one of the motivations for me and Laurie Silvers and Juliana Hammer putting together the volume, which by the way is open access PDF, you can download it freely from my website, or if you search Jihad for Justice online, you'll find a site for it, was precisely that you retired as a full professor from a university, and where was the Festschrift? Right? Mm-hmm. You know, this German word, because they always have a German word when you have a big academic thing. And usually they're in, you know, the students and those who have been PhD advisees and sometimes colleagues of an eminent figure who retires. They all write contributions influenced by his or her, and it's usually his contribution to the study. And then an obscure academic press publishes it, and it's $350, and 200 libraries buy them, and that's it. And the contributors get a copy. And you have to beg a PDF from someone if you ever want to read it or cite it. We didn't want that to happen with this book, right? And so not only, some of the contributions are absolutely academic essays. Some of them are academic essays with a little bit of a twist. Mine cites Taylor Swift lyrics. You know, baby, just say yes. We're talking about consent. Why not? But I also talk about Imam Shafi'i. So, you know, it's legitimate Islamic studies. But there are also letters and other genres and poetry, right? Other ways of responding, because your work has impacted people in so many areas, activists and scholars and folks who are both, and community members who may not identify as either. And so what we wanted to do was something that wouldn't fit within those constraints and would be available, right, in the same ways that you've really sought to make your ideas accessible outside the academy.
Still working on that.
Yeah.
I have YouTube now, you guys.
And Twitter. Don't forget Twitter and Facebook. So I want to actually talk about place, because you've talked about being in Malaysia and you've talked about not being for the long haul in the academy as the right place. You're peripatetic, right? Every time I get a note from you, you're someplace else. And very often it's Southeast Asia, but sometimes it's South Africa, and maybe it's South America, right? I never really know. It might be Europe. I'm wondering if you can say something about what it's been like for you as a Muslim to be a citizen of the world in those kinds of ways, to study at Al-Azhar, to pray in mosques in London, and also at the same time to be an African-American woman in all of those spaces, and both the belonging and the not belonging and what that's meant.
Yeah, I like the belonging and not belonging part of it. I have had to make my peace with not having the feeling of a fixed and stationary community. And it could have been kind of touchy for a little while there, but actually I do have a kind of restlessness, so I don't think that I would have stayed anyway, so why am I trying to pretend that that was the goal? And as a consequence of coming to that realization, and literally over the last few years, I have really looked at what I do have. I was in South Africa last month. I'll be there again next month. And next year is 25 years since I got an invitation to give the Friday sermon in the collective prayer that happens in the mosque. And from that 25 years, which is only 24 now, but in that period of time, I have made actually lifelong friends. I mean, like friends, you know, like really good friends that you laugh with and you at the same time challenge each other. And the same thing with Malaysia, because I came in 1989, which will mean that next year it's 30 years, and I have lifelong friends, you know? I mean, like people that taught me how to hang out at the mall. I never did that as a teenager. I was like such a geek, you know? I like never did the mall thing until I was like an adult in Malaysia. And when I go back now, I want to do it again. It's like so weird, you know, like I don't want to do it here, I hate it, you know, so I don't know. And so I've made my peace with a rotational space. And in fact, as I said, I'm kind of restless by nature, so that if I stay too long even in one house, I have to move the furniture. It's just like somehow I just kind of want things to keep shifting. So I've made my peace with it, and again, I wouldn't recommend it. It just has to be something that kind of works for you. And interestingly enough, we have a lot of families, second and third immigration families in the world whose family life has also been divided across the globe. You know, people who, you know, their parents are maybe still in Southeast Asia, but their siblings are in Europe or Australia or Canada, you know, and then they have kids, and, you know, how do you know? So I feel like the globalization of communication is in my corner, because I can send a message. One of my grandsons, I sent him snow pictures and icicle pictures, you know, because he's never seen snow. He's always been in California, you know. And so we now live in a space where it is possible to keep the communications at various levels, and I don't feel so estranged. But it was hard at certain times because my identity as African American aligns itself with the history and experiences of people in a very particular place. And I am very rarely accompanied by another African American in the places that I go internationally. So there was actually a time in my life about 15 years ago when I said, okay, I'm quitting all this international stuff and I'm just going to focus on my own community. And Allah said, oh yeah, well, let's see how that goes. And it didn't happen, you know. But I was so serious at the time that I said it had an impact on even some of the other relationships that I had there and the work that we were doing. So I have tried to have a stationary fixed community, a stationary fixed location in terms of communities, like the Sufi community. I'm always frustrated, as I said, with their quietism, or just activists. I'm always frustrated with their absolute lack of any kind of intimate interaction with the divine, and they're just like pragmatic, you know, or academics who can sometimes be up there so high that you have to kind of remind them, by the way, you're going to step off the curb here. So I love all of these communities in some ways, and yet I'm looking, my community would be one that has all of them. And I don't see all of them happening except for in certain individuals. And so I gravitate towards those individuals and literally take myself to be in their company when I can, you know, organize it. So it's not something that's recommended. But at the same time, there's always the, you know, for me, the good and the bad of a thing. I like to try to look at the underside and put some light into the darkness. The advantage is that now I really do have substantial friends that are literally, you know, all over the world. And I think in becoming a Muslim, I intuitively knew, as did Africans who were brought here and enslaved, who had Islamic backgrounds, you intuitively know that you are connected to the entire planet. You are not separated from divine truth just because you're separated from your origins, right? And I know that, you know, that the reality of the sacred is manifest everywhere, in every religion, and even in non-religions. For me, I see that manifestation. So I'm no longer so estranged by the mandate to define a territory as exclusively mine, as a Muslim, as a woman, as an African American. That gives me a great deal more freedom, but also it challenges me whenever the ground becomes a little bit destabilized. And I still, don't forget, I live in California, we have earthquakes, so, you know, you have to kind of like plant your feet somewhere in order to get certain things done. It allows me to be 65, but at the same time to continually have interests. Like, I'm not doing things just because of the mandate of the thing. I do that too. I have 5 kids, so I spend a lot of time with just because it's the mandate of the thing, you know, so I know how to do that. But actually, I have the privilege of being able to operate on the grounds of certain motivations, and to go out and experiment with those motivations in a number of different settings, and to let those settings challenge me for the ways in which I have thought about or acted upon with the limits, that I, engaged in it from the first or from the second or whatever. So it keeps the process very much alive for me. And I now encode that into conversations about Islam. And I say, I don't believe in a dead God. I believe in El-Hayy, the living God, and I don't practice a dead religion. So for any place where the only marker that you have is somewhere over there or somewhere back then, you need to get up with the program, because we're moving towards the future every second. So that destabilized setting of my life and my life's work has in fact influenced my perspective on what is life. And again, I wouldn't recommend it. It's not for everybody, but at the same time, to come to a place where I not only see the beauty of it, but also the privilege of it, means that for wherever it is problematic, I will grapple with that as one of the aspects of unraveling and revealing the beauty that's within it. So I'm not retired. I like to tell people I'm retired because it's a good thing, because you can always say no to people. Oh, I can't do that, I'm retired. But my heart and my mind are still kept alive, they're kept sparked, and they're kept interesting by the things that I'm interested in, and by the fact that they are not fixed in one location, with one people, at one time, not even in one language. I'm still just this one body, so it's a nice kind of a springboard for longevity or creativity or something. I don't want to predict either one, but I'm just saying that I'm not at the place where I'm done. And I think probably I would just fall into a major depression if the only work that I had was the work that I'd done 25 years ago, even if I haven't published as much as I really should have, or as our dear Dr. Ali has done. I still feel that I have work. I still feel that I have something. And it doesn't mean people are going to read it, because some of them haven't read what I already did, but I at least don't feel defeated. And I think that shifting, space reality is one of the factors that has been beneficial to me in that way.
So it's so interesting that you use the word destabilizing, because I think of you as someone who is really grounded and rooted. I guess not so much in a particular physical location, but both in a text, in the Quran, and also in your experience of God and the Creator and your practice. However, I think there have been some moments where others have experienced you as profoundly destabilizing, profoundly challenging. And the Claremont Road Mosque was one of them 25 years ago. And then there was Jummah in New York, right? And in both of those occasions, you just spoke a little bit about your own motivations. I think the way people reacted to those events, and that this series of consequences, conversations, controversies that have flowed from them seem to say a lot more about other things that are happening in the world than they do about you and your intentions and your practice. And I'm wondering if you could just speak to that a little bit.
Well, yeah, that's a kind of hard one because it requires me to understand and affirm a perspective that I totally do not share. And yet, because it is still the majority, I would say that Muslim confessional contexts in the U.S. are predominantly conservative. And people are still grappling with whether or not there is a fixed, set answer to every question, even the ones they haven't even thought to ask. And I don't believe that. And I don't even find myself dependent upon that. I think if you peel back enough layers, you will find that there are some things that I hold on to, that I cherish, because I did not come to Islam to begin my path of believing in God. I came into Islam already believing in God, and having had an affirmed relationship because my father was my favorite parent. He was a very loving and consistent, hands-on, very poor black man with a spiritual vision in accordance to his own calling that he received at 15, walking in the fields of Georgia. And he lived that trajectory all his short life. He died in his 40s. And I admired the ethical location of someone whose dedication did not fracture upon, the sort of microscope of perspective that a kid will have. You're going to look at them and you're going to see whether or not they ever do anything, and then you're going to like justify all your teenage angst or whatever. And he was always consistent. And he introduced me to the God of love. So I took the name Wadud because I had been inspired by that before I became Muslim. And then I became Buddhist. And Buddhism is a non-theist tradition. And the value of that for me not only is the practice of meditation, which I still maintain, but also because I really then understood that, the bearded white man in the clouds on the throne was one conception of God, but not necessarily the sum total. And when you come to the place where you outgrow your own childish attachments to, the ultimate reality, it is so much easier for you then to engage in what is theology, that is the conversations about the meaning of the divine. And I still love that stuff. So I'm good. I took a job in religious studies, and so I could talk about God all the time, and nobody would say, "What's wrong with this woman?" Not that they didn't say that as well, but. So it's. I think that there are some things that are fundamental and that are stable for me, but I shy away from it for fear that an attachment to that thing will disallow me the vision of the reality. So as soon as I find myself fixed into something, I think to myself, uh-oh, what's going to happen, And then I say to myself, as we say, tawakkul, I just trust in Allah because I do believe that there is such a strong and palpable presence of that reality that for whatever ways in which my own feeble mind and being cannot, embrace it, all it means is that I've then become fixed on some other idol, some other symbol of it, and that the symbol needs to go. I just sort of, buckle down and prepare myself for it. I'm actually having one right now, which is a kind of an interesting thing with regard to something I learned taking this course last month in South Africa. And I just keep opening up to the possibility that if I pour more intellectual and spiritual exchange into myself with regard to it, that I will make my way through it. And that's been, sort of the course of my life. It does not mean that I would not covet a relationship with the predominantly conservative confessional community of Muslims, here in the U.S. But I have also decided that the capacity for me to contribute as one human being in one body on this planet has been blessed by a plethora of opportunities that did not allow me that comfort. So I can recognize that that would be a comfort. I could even covet it to a certain extent, but I don't depend on it anymore. And as a consequence, it allows me to remember to see the beauty where the beauty manifests, and to open up, as I said, to the challenges as not in and of themselves insurmountable, but in fact as instruments for change and growth and the broadening of perspectives and the increased light. So every place where, I get pushed up against the wall, I'm looking for the magic button in the wall that will cause the panels to slide open, and then I will enter into the next room. So it's not as if I don't experience, sometimes being a feeling, backed up against the wall. It's just that I try not to succumb to it, except to recognize my discomfort and then to say the only way that I would be discomforted is because I am not accepting a reality, and so therefore I want to know what is that reality, and I want to be able to open to it. And as soon as I require of myself what I learned from my father, a trajectory of being honest, of being true and of being transparent. And meanwhile, I sleep with myself and I get up with myself and, all that. So therefore, I know all of the shortcomings. As soon as I require of myself, that kind of dialectic, it frees me then from attachment to any one particular thing as the thing becomes manifest. Except as a utility. Sometimes you need a boat to get across, so you just can't pick the boat up later and carry it on your head and keep going, So in a way, it is the shifting boundaries themselves and the lack of a fixed location that has allowed me to entertain, even intellectually and academically, let alone politically in terms of my activism, how to be able to move the parameters that people are trying to establish in such a way as to limit the possibilities for other human beings to likewise experience that kind of life, I hope that answers your question, because...
It's a complicated question. It's a complicated story. So I said earlier that I wanted to come back to the question of ritual and the question of spirituality. And one of the things you were just talking about so powerfully is not getting attached to idols that we make in our own imaginations, right? At the same time, one of the things that we as Muslims do over and over and over again is salat. Right? We pray in a very particular kind of way, in a way that involves a great deal of repetition. And you also mentioned meditation, and maybe we can talk a little bit more about that. But is there something about salat and the repetition, that the embodied nature of the performance of that ritual that's been meaningful to you as you've had all of these other very different kinds of relationships to certain ideas?
Yeah, well, Salat has not been an experience of a single, sort of consistent manifestation in my life. It has had other forms, because ideally, when I first became Muslim, I just liked the idea of this cessation of everything and preparation for this kind of, sort of ritualistic recognition of your standing agency, bowing deference, and prostrating submission. I loved the embodiment, of the ritual. So I was like a salat geek. I couldn't wait to be at the mosque where I could make 2 tahiyatul masjids, which are greetings to the mosque, and then 4 before the ritual 4, and then the ritual 4, and then 2. I love that stuff. I mean, I did, and then of course, Allah took away my love for it, and that's what happens. I similarly did this thing with the fasting. I just loved it. I mean, I just simply I was just euphoric in it. And then Allah took that away. And each of the times when I go to, the place where my embodied attachment to the thing, to the ritual itself, to its performance, to its symbolism, and its decorations and ceremonial aspects, each of the times that I find myself attached, I am challenged by that attachment itself. As a consequence, I have distilled it down to certain things, and I actually think that the meditation was more beneficial for me. It just happens that I'm part of a Sufi order that is a meditation focused kind of Sufi order, has brought back to me something, and that is, how do you achieve, in the rapid pace which is life, the moments where you experience the absolute presence of the divine. And over the years, I have understood that you must nurture the possibility even through the absence of its manifestation. And so there is a benefit in the consistency of the formulas and their repetition to establish a place within yourself that can be a recipient of that manifestation. Because in reality, that manifestation is all the time and in all circumstances. There is no uniform for it. There is no particular motion. There are no statements. It is always present. But we are consumed by our physical embodiments and gravity and all that stuff, and the kids we love and the colors we prefer, and we're consumed by the temporary. And this consumption in the temporary can obscure the necessity for nurturing the capacity for you to embrace the presence of the eternal at every moment. So for me, there is a goal, and I've had glimpses of successfully attaining that goal, just glimpses. But because of the power of those glimpses, I have to confess, I covet the opportunity to return. And I cannot get there unless I do certain practices. I need to make a space for it. I need to nurture the space that I make for it. I need to honor that space. I need to honor myself in that space. And I go through all these things, and it's a hit or miss sometimes, and sometimes not. One of the things that I have done over the last 4 years is a 10-day silent meditation retreat where you do 10 hours of meditation a day. So it's like 100 hours until you get to quiet your own self, your own mind for a minimum of 5 or 6 days. There are certain things about yourself you could never experience. It cannot happen because I meditate daily. It cannot happen when I do 3 days. It only happens when I have seriously stopped everything long enough for it to enter. And that's my understanding of what are ritual and spiritual practices. They are forums in which you allow yourself to return to the potential for the awareness of the presence of the divine reality at all points. And it's extremely important to me. And I also know that it is literally not mainstream. That most people adhere to the practices of their particular liturgical group in accordance to the specifications that came from the group only out of duty. And duty is extremely important. Again, I have 5 children. There is no question that sometimes it's just duty, right? But if you nurture the highest potential within the dutiful performance, then it becomes singularly the only conduit for your opportunity to have that experience. And because that is so, by my affirmed experience with it, then I will always gravitate towards not only the performance of certain rituals, but also all that leads into the correct performance of those rituals, which is, by the way, a political question. But, I'm the type of person, I invite people to pray without being covered, but I wouldn't do it, right? I invite people to pray without worrying about ritual cleansing, but I wouldn't do it, right? So I understand the need to simultaneously, destabilize prioritization of the outward symbolism above its potential to be the conduit to the sacred encounter. But I also understand that without that, there are a few people, like my father at 15, something happened to him walking through the field, and he's long gone now, so there's not a chance for me to talk and understand better what that was. He experienced a calling, and from that moment until the day he died, he stayed on that trajectory. I didn't get a calling like that. All I got was the sum total of an extremely over-enthusiastic participation in a variety of religious formulas until I began to understand that by dedicating yourself to certain formulas, then they become the doorway that leads, to, the divine. So I am very much wedded, quiet as it's kept. I'm not wedded to the public performance. It's very difficult for me to understand that people think because I'm the lady imam globally that everywhere I go I want to lead prayer for a bunch of strangers. I don't. I really like worship alone. I like it early in the morning by myself. I like that above all things. But I perform the other part as part of the service to community. But it's not the thing that don't call me for that. That's just not really what I like to do. But I love to share in the scenarios where people respect what they can bring to this encounter with the sacred, and acknowledge that there is the sacred, which is beyond any one particular religion or any specific formula of practice, but rather it's potentially embodied in all of them equally, I think.
So I was going to ask about that tension between solitude, which as introverts you and I both need, and togetherness and community, but you actually spoke to that. So I think I'm mindful of the time. We've been talking for more than an hour. One of the things that I wanted to ask you about in terms of community has to do with the increase in a number of places worldwide, in Denmark, in several places in the US and Canada and elsewhere, of woman-centered, non-traditional mosque communities, some of which are queer inclusive, some of which make a special effort to be trans friendly, some of which are very concerned also about accessibility, physical and otherwise, to the mosque space, many of which center women's ritual leadership, either of other women or in gender mixed groups. And I wonder if you could speak to that. I mean, clearly, the fact that you demarcated a kind of outer bound for some people, obviously, and you bore this brunt unfairly, I think, for many others in the community, meant that lots of others could do things that previously would have been perceived as really, really radical, but they weren't going that far, so now it becomes okay. You're going to lead men in a private service? Okay. You're going to lead the men in your family in obligatory prayer? That's all right. You're going to lead women only, but it's going to be Jummah? Okay, fine. Right? So it's become, both by there being this kind of controversy, it's simultaneously authorized, made seem less radical, a range of other things that have happened. But the piece of it that I'm particularly interested in is the communities. You know, you talked about there being mainstream conservative communities, which some of us participate in and some of us feel estranged from. But the fact is there are these other communities growing, and I wonder if you could speak to that, including maybe in Berkeley, where you're currently based.
Yeah. Last week, they actually had a woman in Kerala lead a group, and it was advertised quite widely and everything, and I thought that was Kerala's southern part of India. I thought that was quite interesting because there's still mosques in Kerala where women can't enter at all, you know. And so I love this combination. Well, I have to be honest that my location in a Western, secular, religious freedom, democracy / imperialist location, you know, and again, my father's religious, construction, his trying to service what he considered to be his greatest moral imperative in the context of his own poverty as a black man in America, and what he did to establish, you know, how this was important. He had 8 kids, so we were mostly the congregation, and other people just didn't want to listen. But his tenacity in being able to maintain it, and the freedom of religion that is supposedly offered here, meant that I understood something about the civic component of religion in a dynamic that was very different from my experiences living and working abroad. And that is that, and particularly in the black community, because when the former free people who became slaves migrated after slavery to the north, they established what we used to call storefront churches. And this is religion being made by the people as the people live it. Now, for me, that's actually the only religion. That's I've already said that. I don't, no dead religion, no past, authority, none of that stuff works for me. And so I've seen that people make religion, the good and the bad, and as a consequence, in the context of Islam today, what would that mean? And that would mean that people would take agency to break out of the mold of a repetition of certain forms of religious authority and institution that did not nurture the lived realities of the diversity of the people that existed. So we take agency to make our own mosques. And to have people to understand, it's just like any other sort of non-government organization that you make. You gotta have a couple people and you gotta have a space, and you keep working to increase the number of people or the space or whatever. And to infuse this idea of community-based construction with the historical recognition that that's what has happened everywhere that Islam has spread. That someone's in the community gathered funds to create a musalla or a mosque or a jamia, or that was always what was happening. And then when you look back, and this mosque has been here for 200 years or 300 years or 800 years, you pretend that it is an eternal fixture, and instead what you find is that there was a momentum to bring this into being, and now it becomes a part of precedent. So if the momentum to bring it into being is fluid, belongs to every human being, then we can keep doing it today. So one of the things that I do when I go places is to actually encourage people, if you build it, they will come. And as a consequence, more people are taking agency to do it, and they're defying the necessity of either simply a state-run, or government-run, or religious ministry-run establishment of the sacred order, that the sacred order can be established by people. And in fact, that's what has been the overwhelming history of the growth of Islam. And so to reclaim that now, I confess, I was inspired by living in a liberal, secular society, and the idea of congregation and the power of the congregation to shape what is the church or the mosque or the temple, establishment, and to allow that reality to become something of our intention, that we intentionally go towards it. And so what happens is, just like Sisters in Islam, there were only 8 of us. It starts off small, and then it increases by the mandate within the community. And the mandate within the community, we've already seen, is very strong. And so the more opportunities that people have availed themselves in order to be able to make these things possible, the more that possibility is less and less far-fetched. And then you look back 10 years, 20 years, 100 years, and it's going to be taken for granted that that's what's supposed to happen anyway, right? So be the change you want to see in the world. I hate to quote Gandhi, whose name is currently under siege, but to make it happen requires you only the dedication to do it in context of others who are willing to work with you. I mean, I literally advise people in terms of some of the logistics of how to do it. Because if you can get just 3 people, I don't recommend 2, literally 3 people, and you keep working at it and you grow, and one of those drops off, but by that time 2 other people have come, you need to have a core. You do need to have a kind of community. You do need to have a kind of network. And then you just keep going at it, and every obstacle that comes, you face that particular obstacle. Oh, we need funds. We need to have our own dedicated space. We need to build a space. You grapple with those things as they come about, rather than assuming that I have to walk in, build a new building, have all the stuff established, and no, just start small and let it grow. And that is, I think, what is happening in terms of the inclusive mosque initiatives that are going on in the world. That people are willing not to be the majority. They're willing not to have the authority that is ascribed to the majority, even when the majority is not serving the needs of the whole, the total, right? So they can accept a minority status in numbers, because serving that minority of people is instead, it's a collective, it's a congregation. And so I'm really happy to see the ways in which people are grappling with the different constraints that occur with regard to moving forward. The Inclusive Mosque Initiative in the UK, for example, is explicitly ableist friendly, and they make sure that they always have places that are accessible, that they have ASL. I mean, it's like when you start thinking about inclusiveness, don't just think about gender, don't just think about sexuality, also think about class, also think about ableism. And so the more in which all of these features come together, the more in which we begin to understand realistically how, you know, Islam belongs to us, it belongs to all of us, and we make it as we live it.
I think we should end there because I cannot think of a more powerful summing up of all of the things that you've been talking about.
Thank you so much.
Please join me in thanking Professor Wadud.
I thought you were going to challenge me somewhere.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're so welcome.
Very powerful. Some of us do have to be somewhere else at 6, but there might be time for just 1 or 2 questions. If anybody has a burning question.
Can you speak into the microphone?
I wanted to ask you, Dr. Wadud, first of all, thank you. Your work is, for me personally, I ended up in academia because of all your body of work. Considering Islam in America, talking about like the latest sort of mosque movements, inclusive movements, can you touch upon race a little bit, given that we are such a diverse nation and we have such a big reflection of Islam and so many, you know, there's now khutbahs being done in Spanish in Texas and Southern California. How can we sort of deal with some of the issues that come up of racism and the divisions amongst the mosques, or the diversity in Islam in America?
Yeah, we have unfortunately continued to maintain a singular lack of capacity to actually engage with the very blatant manifestations of racism in the context of Muslim communities in North America. And I'm not really sure why that is, but I do know that it is not going to change until we have that honest encounter. And one of the problems with the honest encounter is that we are not, the mainstream community is not operating on the grounds of, speaking truth. It's operating on the grounds of speaking what is acceptable within the context of certain narrow constraints. So we're not having real dialogue. And it's not going to move forward with real dialogue. Now, the interesting thing is that there is a shift generationally. Because young people coming up in the Muslim community are less able to accept the necessity for ethnic and racial divides that were a comfort zone to a certain extent. I mean, if I go into a room with people, I will naturally gravitate towards other black people in the room. It's a comfort zone, and I understand that. Or if you speak, another language, if you enter into that room and you find someone who speaks that language, you will gravitate towards that. That's fine at a certain level. It is not political awareness. It's just comfort. Why our mosques tend to operate still within that comfort zone is because of the fact that basically the Muslim communities in North America and Europe and Australia feel that they're under siege. And the siege is very real. But unfortunately, the consequence of the siege is that it reiterates the need for very strict and narrow definitions about who they are, and those definitions don't fit the realities that are there. We are probably the most ethnically diverse manifestation of Islam or Muslim community in the world. And we have such a piss poor record about how we actually engage in that and reflect the necessity of these kind of honest dialogues and encounters with regard to it. But there, again, in I'm 65, so younger generation is anywhere from 20 to 40, in the younger generation, there is a much stronger effort to be able to challenge those narrow, sort of safe and comfortable parameters for the benefit of being able to actually open up the community more. But for me, I believe this tendency towards conservatism within our communities is one that believes that and relies upon something behind us as the thing to lean on, and we need to let that go. And it's very difficult to let it go when you're under siege in a very real way in the context of Islamophobia in these places that I mentioned. So in fact, racism is a manifestation of the fragility of Muslim identities. Because when your identity is secure, the records have shown that issues with regard to gender, issues even with regard to sexuality, with regard to race, that they melt away because you go towards something much more essential that you can synthesize from your shared faith experience. But when you are in some type of fragile situation, you have the erroneous expectation that if I'm just a good little girl, or a good little boy, or a good little immigrant, or a good little Muslim, or a good little hijabi, that somehow a white supremacist is actually going to see me as good, and they're going to accept me, and they're going to allow me to do what I need to do in order to live my life. I have a word for that, but I don't think it's permissible on the mic, so that's just not it. You never can achieve your best self by dependent upon the enemy of yourself to ascribe for you what are the parameters of who you are. And so we need to actually grapple, I think, a little bit more strategically with the realities of the diversity that's within the community, not just in terms of the big groups of race and gender and that kind of thing, but those as well, because it is part of a larger framework of our inability to accept this kind of diversity for fear that the diversity itself will manifest it as being outside of what is community, because we have to get a lockdown on this community to protect it in order to be able to have it float along this, water of white supremacy that's still there. And I just think the tactic is not fruitful. But the power dynamics of living today are so stressful. With the big orange balloon in the White House. I mean, it's like the worst manifestation of things I could not even imagine after all the years of work that we considered ourselves to have done. We're living, this is the reality, the capitalist, consumerist networks and the industries that come from that, they are everywhere, but it is not impossible to make the change. And the thing is that, I think the Muslim community has to stop seeing itself as being under siege. And when they do so, then they will grapple more honestly with what's happening within the intra-Muslim context, including with regard to race.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.